When we made the transition from print news sources to broadcast news sources like the radio, it changed how people consumed the media. Radio was a lot less interested in delivering the news than newspapers because people would be more likely to tune in for entertainment, radio dramas and stuff, and music than they would for the news. So we still do get some of our news from the radio. We have stations like NPR and various drive time talk shows that still do deliver us news. But the vast majority of what we consume on the radio is music or other types of entertainment, right? And television was our next sort of foray into different types of media. And that quickly overtook the radio in popularity. People, really liked having the picture along with the sound. And the television did something interesting. It actually, at the beginning, because it was relatively limited how many TV channels we got, kind of focused us back on the news, right? We started, watching nightly news together as a family because if you didn't watch the nightly news, you didn't watch anything. There was no other option. So it was either watch the news or turn off the TV. So people did actually get kind of into watching the news. But at least according to Robert Putnam, there was a problem. This meant that people stopped talking about the news. Before television, Putnam argues, most people got their news by reading the newspaper and then discussing it with people. And he uses the example of bowling leagues, that they didn't just bowl, they talked about the news together and they caught each other up on events of the time. Hence the title of his book, Bowling Alone. We no longer do that. We started just consuming the news on our own, on TV, and not talking it over. So we're bowling alone. Now, this may not be as big of a problem as Putnam anticipated. He actually followed up in the post 9/11 era and said that actually maybe people are engaging with each other more on these things, but perhaps different ways and for different reasons. But that's an idea that maybe television did atomize us a little, separate us a little. And television had some unique problems. The broadcast spectrum is actually limited. At least it was before we ended up with cable and massive broadcasting power. So what happened is there was a concern that too many stations would try to broadcast on the same frequency or extremely close together frequencies that are difficult for the technology to actually pick up as separate. So the government stepped in and created the Communications Act of 1934. And this was basically just a licensing act. It said that the government would have the power to grant licenses to networks so that the government would control how the bandwidth was allocated. However, the government would not use this licensing to regulate in any way, right? Because the First Amendment says the government really can't regulate speech all that much. Can a little, but not very much. So this was one of those examples where a collective action problem, in this case, the tragedy of the commons, was avoided by the government taking action and regulating the commons, in this case, the commons being the broadcast spectrum. So we can see that new media emerged over time and created various different sort of circumstances for the news media and for the government. Now, actual new media, what we would today call new media, is the internet. And I know the internet to you probably feels like old, like you've always had the internet. But actually, the internet was really not available to the public until the 90s. And even then, it was dial-up internet. It meant you literally plugged your computer into your phone line. You might be thinking, wait, phone line? But remember landline phones? Probably your grandparents have them. Those actual like plug-in-the-wall phones, you had to do that with your computer to connect to the internet. So it wasn't until 2000 that we started getting broadband internet. And when we got broadband internet, sorry about that, excellent alarm going off. When we got broadband internet, that made it much easier to connect online and to consume news online. And we start to slowly enter the realm of politics. In 2004, Howard Dean was the first major party contender to use the internet. He didn't actually get the Democratic nomination, for what that's worth, not because of his use of the internet, granted. 2008 was really the first time the internet played a main role in a presidential election. Obama, who was the candidate at the time, had Facebook, Twitter, and MySpace accounts. Twitter was brand spanking new at the time. MySpace was already starting to get a little dated. Wonder how many of you have heard of MySpace. And if you haven't, that's okay. It was already kind of old in 2008. Now, today, all the candidates are online, right? We expect them to be on Facebook, Twitter, and all sorts of different platforms. Bernie Sanders has a Twitch account, which just cracks me up. We also see major news outlets doing the same thing. So the news media is using this new form of communication. So major news outlets have blogs, websites, podcasts, all sorts. And new types of news outlets have even just sprung up on the internet. The Huffington Post is on the internet, right? It's not a print newspaper, but there it exists as a news source on the internet. It also changed the profit model for newspapers and TV's news, right? Because people can go online, then they're not reading the print ads. They're not seeing the broadcast advertisements on commercial breaks. So it changes how news outlets are going to earn money and how they have to attract people to their websites to earn money rather than just depend on print or television ad revenue. It also created a platform for citizen journalists, for people like you or me to try to report the news. So how do we contend with that as news media or not? So if you're interested in those questions, I encourage you to check out our other videos and look down at the different slides.